Hello everyone, and welcome. My name is Kent Trammell, and this is the fourth video in a series of tutorials covering the creation of a realistic portrait in Blender. In part 4, we're going to start shading and lighting our head. We'll create an initial light setup as well as our subsurface scatter shader. We won't be implementing any textures in this video, but instead focusing on what the shader is doing with solid colors. This will provide a good foundation for plugging in our textures later. Also, this is our first real-time video in the series. Okay, so I'm gonna get started where we left off. We've just got our head here with all this sculpted detail. We've also painted our textures, but that's not applied at the moment. We won't need that for this tutorial. So let's start by getting our lights set up. This will mainly be a testing kind of light rig, just to test the shader, what the subsurface is doing, not high samples or anything. See, I'm going to rename these eyes. Let's get them named properly. And okay, so let's add a lamp, and this is going to be an area lamp, and we're just going to put this in front of the head, just pointed right at it. Very key light. Okay, so I like the way that this fall off is set up just by default. Keep in mind we are going to change all this for our final render, but for testing, just get something quickly together. I'm going to bump the samples up to 4 on the shadows and turn it to race shadow. And the size, we're going to change it to 10. And also we need to add a lamp, a camera, so we have something to render from. Hit 0 to go into the camera, and we're going to lock it to the view. And also I'm going to change the render settings to render 1200 by 1080. And I'm going to change the lens, let's see, the focal length, to let's change it to 60 for now. And line it up in the middle, just to give us a good preview. And so then I'm going to turn off lock to camera view. And at 50% of the render resolution, I am going to first add a shader, a blank shader. Turn the specular off, and I usually like to turn the value to sort of a mid-gray, and that tells me more information about the light, how intense it is. And yeah, so let's just do a render right now, see what it gives us. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm gonna quit that and select my head, because in the multi-res modifier I have my render setting up to 5. And this is what we'll do for our final render. We'll have it at its highest level, but for testing we don't need to do that. It takes significantly longer for the ray tree to build, so I'm going to change that to 3 for testing purposes, and then you'll see it render in a couple seconds. So yeah, 3 seconds. So okay, that's honestly, I'm going to parent the eyes and the head to an empty. And do that. Okay. Control P to object. This is going to be called, I'm just going to call it head group. And I'm going to rotate that in Z to give us one of these angles. And I'll render it again. Okay, I think this is going to be a good angle to test from. And yeah, the intensity on the light looks pretty good. The shadows are fuzzy, but that's okay. Honestly, with subsurface shading, some of the fuzziness is actually taken away, and you can get away with lower samples, which is kind of a plus since it's more intense shader type. Okay, so the light's kind of set up decent for testing, and now I'm going to add, first, before I go into the 3-layer setup, I'm going to just run through just a single layer setup, the default subsurface method for Blender's shaders materials. So with the material we've created, I'm going to call this SSS single layer, and I'm going to change the diffuse color to sort of a skinish, a pale skin color. Let's see, yeah, something like that. That's fine. And so with SSS presets, it will check on subsurface scattering, and then usually I'll go straight to skim milk and see what that renders like. Let's just do that real quick. Okay, so we've got subsurface, obviously. It looks, to me, a little bit more like, the biggest problem here is the scale is way off. Too much light is scattering in, and that's not what we want. Why I like to go into the skim milk and just rendering, it gives me a good base to start from, because the next step is to change this scale over here. So by default, the skim milk scale is at 0.01. And so I'm just going to change it to 0.00, I'm sorry, yep, 0.01, and render that. I'm going to do it in another slot so we can compare, and just see, compare the differences. And okay, so this actually is too far the other way, and there's not enough scatter going on. If we go back and forth, you see a lot of color in the shadows. That's what you're looking for when you're setting up a subsurface shader. What the subsurface does is it scatters light, and therefore where there are shadows, color from your object, whatever, in this case skin, so like an orangey red is going to shine through those shadows, and it's going to soften the shadows and also add color to the shadows. So here we've got way too much color and not enough dark in the shadows, and then in slot 2, way too dark, and you almost can't see any color from the subsurface. So from 0.1 to 0.01 is too much, so now I'm going to jump to 0.03 and change to slot 3 and render again. Okay, so this is actually pretty good. This is we can see on the edge of the shadow. Well, for generally in the shadow, it's a lighter color compared to 2, where it's almost solid black, and 3, we've got more color poking through. And specifically on the outer edges of the shadow areas, there's more color. It's more saturated, and that's what we want. We want sort of a level like this. So I'm going to leave the scale at 0.03. That seems fine to me. And go on to the next setting, which is scatter color. It's the little RGB selector underneath scale. And I'm going to leave this at almost white. It's by default, the value is about 0.9. So I'm going to leave it there. And I typically keep it on a grayscale value. I usually don't change it because, just for example, if I change it to a skin color, like that would be the temptation, or like a red would make sense to me. And then I do a render. I'll show you why I leave it at a grayscale value. You'll start to see a lot of funky colors going on. And so here you can see all my shadows are a very green color. So that's a little weird. I usually leave it black and white, a grayscale value, and that's a way to make it more intense or less intense of a scatter effect. So I'm just going to leave it at, turn the saturation off and put the value back at 0.9 and leave it there for now. And so next, the RGB radius, and this is, as far as I know, unique to Blender as a method for controlling the radius, the scatter radius of the light. So it's the first value is obviously R, second value is G for green, and the third value is B for blue. And so for skin, you have more of an orangey red scatter radius, I guess. And so we'll want the top value to be greater than the value below that, and the green value to be even greater than the blue value. And so for this, I'm just going to change it to 18, 8, and 4. And let's render that. Okay, so where before we had more of an orangey, more of an orangey, almost a little bit yellow color, now we've got more of a red color. It feels a little bit more flesh-like. And let's see, so some other settings, we've got the blend options over here, and this is where you can blend the diffuse color or the diffuse texture. So for now I'm going to leave it, for testing, I'm going to leave it at color at 1 and texture at 0 for when there aren't any textures, but later I'm going to turn the color to 0 and turn the texture up once we have the textures plugged in. Okay, so and the scattering weight, once we break up the shader into different layers, I'm going to mess with the scatter weights, but for this, I'm going to, for the single layer method, I'm going to leave both at 1. And then the error percentage, error tolerance rather, I rarely change it. Honestly, I've never changed it. It's a good value at 0.05, but if you for some reason get artifacts or weird artifacts in the subsurface, then that is where you would change the quality. It'll take more time, as the description says. Lower values are slower, but they are higher quality. So I'm going to leave it at 0.05. That does pretty well in my experience. And okay, so if we look at this, it's not terrible. Like I actually could, I think a lot of people could get away with this as whether it's a secondary character or even if fleshed out enough and the textures work really well, this could pass as a good subsurface option, to be honest, and I believe that. But since I'm going to try and push this as far as I can, and also coming from a background in Mental Ray and V-Ray, I'm used to the 3-layer system. So thanks to Ben Simmons, he outlined a very good way to composite 3 layers of subsurface together in Blender, and I'm gonna take a lot of that but I just put it into a single shader that happens at render time. Okay, so yeah, this is the single layer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 3 more slots in my material slots, and I'm going to change this. I'm going to duplicate the single layer subsurface material. I'm going to rename it backscatter. And this is what we're going to start with. This is just the scatter coming from the backside of whatever model has the shader on it. So with that created, I'm going to turn, let me check my notes real quick. I'm going to turn the diffuse color to a sort of a darkish red color, definitely saturated. So yeah, a dark red, pretty saturated. And intensity of the specular, I'm going to leave at 0. And so with subsurface checked on, some settings I'm going to change our front scatter. I'm going to turn that to 0 because, again, this is only for the back scatter. And let me check my notes. Sorry, I'm going to be doing that a lot. Let's see, scatter color. Yes. I'm going to change that to a value of 0.2, which is going to be below mid-level gray. And RGB radius I'm going to change to 3, 1, and 0.05. Okay, so let's start over our slots, our render slots for comparing, and let's render that. If I'm not mistaken, that shouldn't give us really anything. Yeah, okay, so these values are not any good. The RGB radius I have in my notes as working, but obviously that did not work. So I'm going to, let's bump this up, try and get some subsurface going on. I'm going to change it to 15, 1, and 1. Let's check that out. Oh, of course, that's the problem. There are no lights shining on the back of this model, so there is essentially no backscatter happening. So let's fix that business, and let's duplicate this area light. First, let's name it. I'm going to call it light key. I'm going to duplicate it with the cursor as my pivot point. I'm going to rotate in Z around the head, and I am actually going to change the head group back to 0. Let's rotation back to 0. I'm going to rotate this down a little bit, and we're going to make the size of this fill light, call it light fill. And this fill light is going to be a size of 30, and let's just rotate that a little bit more to the back of the head. Yeah, something like that. And let's do a render, and since I'm changing lights, we don't need this backscatter working right now, so I'm going to get rid of it, add a new blank material just to give us an idea of the lights. So let's render that image, and okay, and that's fine. That should give us some backscatter to test and play with. And, I might bump it. Well, let me turn the spec off. Sorry, I'm a little scatterbrained as I'm doing this real time. I'm going to change the energy to 2. Like a little bit of a little rim effect. Yeah, that's feeling better. That's pretty good. So I'm going to duplicate that light, rotate in Z with cursor as the pivot to almost directly behind the head, a little bit off to the side. But this is going to be heavily our rim light. It's going to be focused a lot on the rim. So I'm going to change this size to 80. That's pretty big. We're going to bump up the energy to 5. I really want this to give me a nice rim effect. So that's not doing it there. Let's rotate a little bit more. Render it again. Maybe it needs a little more strength, a little more energy. Let's change the energy to 10. See what that does for us. Okay, a little bit more of a rim effect. Reflection will help with that later. Of course, this is, again, just for testing, so I'm going to say that that's fine. That'll give us plenty of backscattering light. And, yeah, so now with the head rotated towards us, I'm going to plug back in the backscatter material. And let's render it with the backscatter on. Now we should see some backscattering happening. A lot in the ears, particularly. Okay, so that's actually kind of what I'm looking for. Mainly black, because the way these layers are going to be blended together, it's going to be a screen. So, areas of the head that aren't black will screen on top. And so that's what we want. Black areas won't show up. So, or won't affect the layers below it. So that's good. That's what we're looking for. Just, we're going to see that red in the ear and along the rim of the head, but that won't show up as much as the ear will. So that's pretty good. Now this is just basically what you want to look for. We're going to have to go back in and tweak these significantly once we combine all the layers together. But this is sort of the backscatter effect that we want for now. And Yeah, so now I can move on to, well, I'm going to store that down here in the slots, backscatter. And then I'm going to duplicate that one. No, yeah, duplicate that one. We're going to call this Subdermal. Okay, so this is going to be sort of the fatty layer of your flesh, I guess. And that's going to be more of an orangey, yellow kind of color. So let's move the color up, get a little more value. And yeah, so an orange kind of like that we'll start with. And here we're going to turn the front scatter weight to 1 and the back scatter weight to 0 because we don't want any backscatter. We've got that covered in the backscatter material. Okay, let's see. RGB values, let's start from 5, 1, and 1. Let's do a render. Let's go to next slot, render this. Okay, so we're definitely seeing the scatter effect, and that's pretty saturated. A big problem that I see initially is in these shadows, the color is so saturated and so bright that it almost feels like it's glowing. And we even have some green going on in the eyelids up here. And that's a little too much. When we combine that, all the layers together, the shadows will feel like they're glowing instead of just having light soften them. So that's not any good. And well, let's change the RGB radius to 3, 2, 3, 2, and 2. Let's try that again. Okay, this is feeling better. Yeah, this is better. We still have a little bit of color in the shadows. Perhaps we can add a little bit more, but for now that's going to be good. That's scattering. It's got the yellow color, so that's pretty good for a base subdermal layer material. So let's call that finished for now. Store it down here. Subdermal. Let's duplicate that again. And this is going to be our final layer, the epidermal. Alright. Let's change this color actually to almost gray with a little bit of purple in it. That's going to be, yeah, that's going to be pretty cool. Yeah, actually, because the way you get this peach flesh tone color is all of them combined. So you've got the dark red of your muscles, I guess, and then your fatty layer of orangish yellow, and then the topmost layer, the epidermal layer, is actually kind of a dead color. It's very desaturated, a little bit of purple, and those combined should give us a nice peachy flesh tone. So let's leave that at purple. Let's change the scatter radius. Let's start with 2, 1, and 1. And again, front weight at 1, back weight at 0. Let's change to 4. Render image. Yeah, that feels pretty good. Yeah, I like that quite a bit. Got enough red popping through in the shadows that should mix well with the layers below it. Yeah, that's pretty nice. For now, all these levels will change once we combine it here momentarily. Okay, so that's good for the epidermal layer. Oh, sorry. I'm going to store it there, and now I'm going to X out of this topmost slot, this first slot, add a new material. We're going to call it SSS Tri-Layer. And then I'm going to turn on nodes, use shader nodes. Okay, so I'm going to split my view here and go to the node editor and materials, and here is our tri-layer node material. So the first one we're going to load, the first material we're going to plug in is going to be our backscatter. So pick that over here in the node editor. I'm going to Shift D this 2 times. For 3 total materials, we're going to next select our subdermal and then our epidermal layer. Okay, now we're going to add a mix node, color mix, and the mix is going to be screen, and we're going to change the factor to 1. Let's duplicate that node. Plug in our other nodes. Okay, and even in the material preview, we can get an idea that this is looking a little fleshy. It's still pretty tan, I guess you could say. So just after combining it all together, let's do a quick render. And well, quick render. It's still going to be relatively quick, but you're essentially tripling the render time now because it has to calculate 3 separate subsurface materials and combine them and render them all at one time. So this is kind of where I guess you could separate the perfectionists from the impatient, and it depends on what this would be used for. If this is a background character, I would suggest that you use the single layer default subsurface features in Blender's material and not worry about setting up the 3-layer system, because you can get a good result from it. But for me, I'm going to go the perfectionist route in this tutorial and try and explain as detailed as I can with this shader. So with this first one, this first initial render, it looks okay. He's starting to look a little bit like Sculpey, if you ever use clay or ever have sculpted with clay. So that's it's a little bit fleshy. Let's see. Let me just look at it for a second, see what's kind of bumping me about it. Initially, it looks like the backscatter is a little too red. It's not orange enough. So I am going to change. Let's go into the backscatter material, and by clicking on it in the node editor, its options will show up here in the properties panel. And I'm going to change the RGB radius to 5 or 15, 10, and 1. So let's render that now. Change the slot, and this should give us a more realistic orangey tone to our backscatter. So still, even with the 3 subsurface shaders or materials rendering all together, we're still getting a render in, of course this will vary based on your machine, but in about 30 seconds we get a good representation of our render, and that's great for testing. So yeah, I like that color a little bit better. That's more realistic. It's might be me, but I feel like it's not enough backscatter perhaps. So I'm going to stay in the backscatter, and let's first change the material value. Let's change it to 0.5. And here we should see an increase. Yeah, we should see an increase in the value of the backscatter. Like it's going to be more bright. Yeah, so that's that scatter color is a good way to control how bright each subsurface material is, and that's actually a little too bright, perhaps. So I'm going to change it to. I'm just going to keep it at 0.3 for now. Okay, so that feels okay for the backscatter for now. And again, I'm not going to be able to, even at the end of this tutorial, say like this is perfect scattering, you know, never have to change this. I'm constantly changing the values all the way up until the final render. Even when I switch or change lighting, I need to switch the values around. I'm not even sure if it's possible, I guess, to have a perfect scatter shader from all angles, all lighting conditions. But this is just kind of to explain the foundation of the scatter shader. But anyway, so I'm going to call this is good for the backscatter. The subdermal is not, that could use a little bit of work. Let's change this RGB radius to 6, 4, and 4, and that's going to double the radius. So right now, let's go back to this other image. Yeah, okay. The shadows are still a little bit dark. I would like to see a little more light scattering in to the flesh, specifically on the subdermal layer. So I'm going to go in there, and by doubling the RGB radius for each RG and B, it'll be twice as much light scattering in. So I'm going to change that to 6, 4, and 4. Simple math. And let's see how soft the shadows get now, how much more light is passing through. That's feeling pretty good initially. Yeah, it's feeling quite a bit softer and more fleshy. I like that. You can definitely feel it in this ear. Yeah, I'm a fan of that change. So let's compare. Excuse me. So you can see how dark the shadows are, not as much light passing through, and then doubling the subdermal layer just softens it up really, really nice. Yeah, that's feeling pretty good. Yeah, fantastic. You'll probably notice that I'm leaving spec off this whole time. I tend to do that because I don't actually use the spec channel. I use just reflections and use that as my spec. So you'll see, you might think that the detail's washed out and like, where are my pores? For one thing, we're on a lower render level, but even to finish off this tutorial, I'll bump it up to 5 so you can see the full detail. But even then, you're not seeing as much detail as you would expect, and that's because the subsurface is washing some of those details out. But later, when I add spec and compositing, you'll see all the details, all the wonderful bumps and pores start to pop out, and that combined with this washed out detail from the subsurface is what gives you your final skin quality. So I guess I look forward to that moment. You're not going to see it here, but just and be anticipating that, because it's going to be an exciting moment when they're combined. Anyway, I'm getting excited. So yeah, I'm good. That's pretty good. I'm okay with this shader. It's got a nice skin tone already, even without a texture. It really reminds me of Sculpey at the moment. That this will be great as a foundation because I can, plug in the textures and using these colors that I've used in my shaders as a base. Like I can take this exact diffuse RGB value, and then when I create my my textures, I can use that value to govern the general saturation and level of my texture. And then when you plug them all back in, you should have all the same values in your scatter, but with that textured detail and different tonal changes that will just finish it off and make it look very skin-like and realistic. Hopefully that's the plan. Okay, so I'm going to do one final render with the backlights turned off. So fill, and I need to rename that to light back, light rim. And let's turn that off and rotate this head group a little bit like that. Let's do a render. Let's see what that gives us. I think this kind of angle, one key light from a certain angle, out in this case the front, showing down can really give you a lot of information on what your scattering is doing. And yeah, I like that. Yeah, I like that quite a bit. Especially in this ear, it just feels very, very fleshy. And yeah, I mean, that feels pretty nice. So yeah, I mean, well, I'm a little surprised it turned out. I'm happy at this point. I thought I would run into more mistakes, but cool. So I guess to end this tutorial, I'm going to bump up my multi-resolution render levels to 5, and then change the resolution to 100, and I'm going to render this. So I couldn't help myself. I went ahead and turned on the specular. The excitement was too much, and just with that speck on there, it kind of finishes off the subsurface effect a little bit, and this is just a preview of what our final speck will look like, which will actually be reflections. But so this will kind of end the tutorial. This leaves us with a foundation for us to plug in our textures in the next tutorial, and hopefully keeping all the RGB values consistent in the textures as they are in the shaders now. Should give us a pretty decent result after the next tutorial, with the head at least. And then we'll start to add accessories like his clothes and hair. And anyway, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for watching.